Hello, how are you this morning?
Hello, very good. It's kind of afternoon here in New Zealand, so almost 3 o'clock. So, I definitely the time zones got me today. I was like, oh, is the time zones going back in Sydney as well as here? Because we go in at different times and come out at the
Yeah.
same time, which seems like
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
just to add that extra confusion.
We're very sorry for the confusion. Apparently, I've been told off for trying to pick a weekend off the top of my head.
Yeah. Kane, you might want to turn your mic up just a little bit.
Oh, sure. Give me one sec.
We can hear you, but it's a little soft.
A little soft. There we go. How is that? Any better?
Much better.
That's better. Thank you.
Cool.
All right, so we will let you get started with your first of the themes of redundancies and layoffs.
I'm super excited to see the next talk, but I guess I'll kick off. So today we're going to be talking about securing layoffs without being an asshole, as we say here. So thankfully, the content I'm talking about today has nothing to do with my current role. So I'm actually going to keep the kind of about me slide pretty light. Adding to this, I'm going to say us a lot and we, and that's because this talk wasn't made necessarily by me. It was made by about 10 people who have been through the same thing. And I'm just kind of the speaker on behalf of the collective experience, let's say. And so all of us have kind of been through this, and we all wanted to talk around, the stuff we've done and the mistakes we've made. So I guess this is a pretty heavy topic, and not a lot of people talk about this, which is understandable. Most people don't want to relive this. And especially when they're at the same employer, they often don't want to talk about this stuff to bring back that negative attention. And kind of for the early half of this talk, I'm going to keep the process a little bit clinical. I'm going to kind of talk about the process and things like that. And I'm going to kind of end a bit more in the last 10 minutes with my personal notes on this kind of thing. And finally, I'm going to be talking about layoffs, RIFs, which is a reduction in force. I'm going to just use these terms interchangeably. A lot of this advice is good for both of them, but technically, I guess we're talking about a RIF, which is a large reduction in force at a company. So we're talking layoffs of, 100, 1,000, 10,000 people. So like I say, I'm going to speak about our experiences first. And so I've had the unfortunate scenario of being the executioner, as it's called, a couple of times throughout my career. And usually it's been small scale, it's been like a product that gets moved to other areas of the company. It's been maybe a small team getting moved around. And it's usually, like I say, less than 50 people, I would say. But in my last role at Shopify, I was kind of within a series of RIFs that a few thousand people were let go in each one. And so it kind of, gained in scale as we were going. And of course, my experience was not unique. 2022 and 2023 have been pretty crazy for tech, I think. And I'll kind of talk about the numbers a little bit now, which is we're kind of down from the peak, which I think is a good thing. I don't have any more up-to-date numbers from here. They're still going on. They seem to be smaller, which I think we can all agree is a positive thing. But this information, may be needed by people in the future. Maybe we go through this again. Maybe there are people who haven't done this yet. So I figured, why not talk about it now we've kind of gone through it? And I think the biggest thing I need to talk about is scale. Most systems aren't designed to deal with 10,000 requests, 20,000 requests at once. Amazon's largest layoff here of almost 28,000 is larger than, most companies. And so how do you scale your systems to go through this? And it's going to really depend on whether you're right-sized, whether you're testing, and all of those kind of things. And so before we talk about what we do during the process, we kind of need to talk about information gathering. And it's going to probably start like this. It's going to be a talk with your boss, the CEO, COO, someone senior. You're probably going to have to sign an NDA or have your name put on a list. And the way that these things develop is that senior leadership often include people when you're needed. So you'll be included hopefully early on in the process, but you may be included very last minute. And you're probably going to get notified a little bit ahead of time, but you're not going to have a huge amount of time to prepare in many cases. I think that's really what we're going to talk about here, which is determining the biggest three things first. And time is number one. Like, if you have to do a riff within 3 days, it's going to look very different if it's a month's time. Now, of course, the longer it is, the more chance there is of leaks, information getting out. Obviously not ideal. And scale, of course, like I said, like losing a product is going to look different to losing 20% of the company, 50% of the company. You're going to have to think about kind of the scale of what you need to do within the time. And you may have to increase or decrease those time windows. And finally, business risk. So you're going to have to think about risk to the company. And we're going to kind of talk a lot about risk during this talk, and not just security risk. But I think once you have all that information, take a breather and realize you'll fuck it up, like probably in multiple ways. You can aim for perfection, but you won't achieve it. Like, if I asked you to do a really complicated project and you had to deliver it in 2 weeks and you had to do it just with yourself or with a small team, what would your chances of success be? Probably not super high. And I can give you a bit of a story time here of someone who helped contribute to this talk. He once locked every single Windows machine in the org instead of just those who were affected. And so I think, you will have problems. You may even contribute to those problems. And I think being able to recover from them and having these different systems in place to recover is going to be super important. And the whole thing is going to be a series of trade-offs. Like, you won't have time to verify every single thing that you're going to do. Like, just move fast on the small stuff and then verify the big stuff, like any big project, really. And I'm going to be splitting this into kind of 3 sections now. We're going to have the pre-layoff period, what you do during the layoffs, and then after the layoffs. So going into the pre-layoff period, the thing that is the most tightly protected thing is the list, which is the list of impacted individuals, so the people who are going to get removed. The list is constantly changing. I've had it change after the process has gone out to already remove people, and so then you need to think about adding people back in afterwards. And so be aware that this is something they're not going to want to give you. You might get it at last minute, and you're going to have to deal with problems along the way of it changing. And my advice is you need to look at the list. Like, you have to, because it's going to dictate the risk. But don't look at it too closely. Like, don't look at it to see who your friends, your family, your colleagues that you work with a bunch. Try not to look at that. Like, it's just going to make the process worse, honestly. You can look at it for your own team, and I would say look at it because if you need to get people involved in this project, you obviously don't want to bring impacted people in. And so, like, you as a security or IT person, you probably deal with risk all the time, and you probably deal with pressure and crazy situations every day. This isn't something that your leadership team generally do, certainly not in this realm. So I think the biggest call out here is don't be the IT person, don't be the security person, like, be the risk person. Like, bring up things that may impact the business, not just systems. So when you are communicating risks, you got to be aware that, like, things can leak, you can break things, you can lose credentials. I would say the one thing here is that most decisions you make aren't a one-way door, but just do be careful when you are sharing this thing. Like, you do need to sort of operate in that need-to-know environment. And once you get the list, I would say highlight any critical individuals or groups or super admins super early on in the process. Ideally, remove them the day before or early in the day. You can do cooldown periods where, like, they might stay on for a couple months, but realistically, I think most people would rather just bite the bullet and just deal with it on the day. You probably don't want to drag it out And so I would say probably don't do it, but do highlight the risk of these individuals being impacted and whatnot. And I think, your super admins for your various tools, probably number one here. And do bring in a team. Try not to do this yourself. You may have to, right? Like, you may be a one-person shop, but if you can bring in different people for different things, I would bring in someone from infra if you can, someone who knows devices, someone who knows IAM. Like, those three are probably the hardest things that you're going to have to do. And so you can build your design in kind of two ways, but there's a whole host of ways you can do it between them, right? You can go for security first, where you lock everything down, or you can go for empathy first, where you limit access, you kind of have one-to-ones with the person, you let them keep the laptops and stuff like that. And my advice is that senior leadership usually go security first. They're usually scared of leaks and that kind of stuff. And you as the security person might have to say, no, actually, like, we don't care about security as much as you think we do. Like, or we do, but we have compensating controls that stop the issues that you think. And so I would try and advocate for an empathetic approach. Like, this is not going to be a good day for these people. And so anything you can do to make it better is probably going to be worth the effort. In section 4, we're going to go into some of the more technical designs. So we're going to be talking about laptops, access, identity, that kind of stuff. And number one is the comms problem. Like, there's definitely no good way to do this. Like, you will have people complain no matter how you do. Some people want one-to-ones. Some people don't think it's worth the time. One thing I would say is that you do not want to keep people waiting. You don't want to have people waiting like 5 or 6 hours to find out if they're impacted. And so you need to be wary of things like mailers, like Google, where if you're sending out 1,000, 10,000 emails, it's going to take time. So you might need to split down into like 10, 20 mailers and sort of pull from a unified list. Because if you don't do that, you will be waiting way too long. And so we've got here the personal contact problem, so how you communicate with those people. I think the biggest thing here is don't remove access to the things people communicate with. And we have seen this happen before. You can do like personal email, personal SMS, but it's fiddly. If you're going to do it, use both, but you'll probably still not hit people. Like, get people to update it in advance if you can, but that will also maybe set off some red flags. And identity, so whether you use, Okta, Ping Identity, Azure, removing access is probably one of the more painful things you're going to have to deal with. Vendors rate limit you. And so my best advice here is, if you have to do this, do reach out to them in advance. Tell them that you're going to need to run 1 million commands, and you're going to need your API limits bumped up, because if you hit API restrictions, it's going to slow everything you're doing down. Like, really low test if you can. But, you may only have a week to do this, so you might have to kind of deal with the cards you're given. And some companies allow for limited access. So rather than removing everyone, maybe keeping them in a separate Slack, lowering their access instead of denying it entirely, having a one-to-one with their manager, and then getting removed at the end of the day. This is good. It's something I recommend. But in some countries, you actually have to do this. You can't remove access until there has been a one-to-one consultation. So definitely, when you are going through this process, you definitely want to consult with your legal team and just make sure that you verify as much as you can with them. And devices, which is kind of more my area. Obviously, don't lock devices if people are going to get the news on their device. Just be aware MDMs are really slow. And if you're sending out 1,000, 2,000 commands, you're probably going to have to get up at 3 a.m. To start this command. And then people are going to turn on their device. It needs to check in. And that means that probably not all the wipes will go through. Like either people won't turn on the device because they hear the news or they see it on their phone. Maybe they disconnect their Wi-Fi to try and keep their laptop or something like that. You can track the successful commands, but it's a tough one to recommend. I would only do it if you have to, like if you have devices not managed by MDM. Some people who contributed to this talk said that they had HR literally go into a meeting with individuals and video like their screen and have them prove they did it, and like watch them do it on Zoom where it was all recorded. I personally feel like this is a bit too far, to be honest with you. Not to mention hella awkward, but you know, maybe in some high privacy, high security areas, maybe that's required, but I'll leave that up to you. And infrastructure access. So looking at, you know, SSH keys to access, you know, EC2 instances, looking at root accounts, risky service accounts. Like it's really hard because it's layered levels of access. So you've got, you know, your VPC, your individual networks, you've got all the infrastructure there. There's multiple ways and levels to get into this stuff, and making sure that you have all of it. Hopefully you have a process for that in advance, generally for just your normal removal. But doing it en masse is difficult. And some people store things, they will spin up an instance. And so unless you're putting everything through teleport or some equivalent, it can be quite difficult to actually remove all of this access in a timely, decent way. Okay, so section 5, we're going to be talking about what happens during the layoffs. And so this is probably the most stressful part of it, because you have probably been doing a lot of late nights preparing for this. And now, of course, you need to start doing detections, alerting. Maybe your stuff is going wrong and breaking. But I think exfil is probably the easiest thing to talk about. Like, there are so many ways to detect, you know, exfil and do DLP and all of that. You should try and build high-risk alerts and dashboards in advance if you can. Then you can share them with your detection team, or maybe it's you doing this. And then you can, you know, look for this stuff. But everyone knows DLP is kind of, you know, you catch the low-hanging fruit, and that's about it generally. And so basically my advice is don't be afraid to lock things down the day before. So maybe if you have USB open and you're like a very open company, maybe lock that down for everyone the day before and just say, hey, sorry, it's an IT issue or something. Like, we can't fix it till tomorrow. But I would hesitate to recommend this unless you're pushing people towards a path where you have detections. Like if you have really good detections for cloud DLP, like people uploading to Dropbox and, you know, web browser logs and all of that stuff, then yeah, maybe locking down USB is good. At least what I would say is it cuts down some of that low-hanging fruit for the opportunist downloaders. And you will see exfil. Is it important exfil? Is hard to tell. Like people are going to be downloading payslips, performance reviews. Do we care about that? Probably not, right? Like you're going to give that to them anyway. But it can get into some sort of, you know, maybe people are downloading data from a project they did. Maybe it doesn't have any sensitive data, but really you should have a process for people to request this after the fact. And shared accounts is something you should keep an eye on, especially. Usually these accounts are shared between multiple people, difficult or impossible to rotate, and they often don't have MFA or they have weaker forms of MFA. Very easy for someone to take one of these passwords when they go, use it to get access back in after the fact. And people will surprise you, even though you think even those who should know better. You know, don't try and rationalize it. It can be, you know, interns who have only been there for a few weeks. It can be execs who have been there for years. It's just a numbers thing. Like if you lay off enough people, there'll be people who try and do weird stuff. Finally, we're going to talk about after the layoffs. So what happens, you know, the day after or maybe later in the day. And so we're kind of be going into some of the more personal aspects as well as still a little bit of technical stuff. it's like, as security professionals, I think it's important for us to maintain privacy as well for as many people as that we can. And so you will get bombarded, or your IT team will be bombarded by manager requests for employee data. You know, hey, I need access to Kane's email for the next 2 years because he was working with customers. No, basically, like, feel free to deny this stuff, like time box it, make sure it goes to security and HR, make sure it's approved. Don't be afraid to kind of be a hard ass on this stuff, I think. And kind of going into the more personal stuff, I think like survivor guilt is something to watch out for, especially in your team. And we're going to talk about, you know, how you can spot this in your team and how to deal with it. But I think in the earlier stages, please encourage management to provide support, counseling, that kind of thing after the fact. And in rare cases, you may have to terminate yourself. And again, a few of the people who contributed to this talk had to do this. And so very much akin to, you know, the stories of the people who built the pyramids being, you know, kind of put in there with them after the fact. It's kind of a similar deal. You will often know in advance. So, I mean, if you're put in this situation, I guess you can advocate for a good severance package for yourself. But if you can create systems where you don't need to do anything, that's better, because then you don't have to worry about doing this. Like, it is not a good scenario to be laying yourself off. Like, if you think, you know, you'll be able to keep up morale during this, I'd be very surprised. And executioner guilt, which is something that if you are put in this situation, you probably will experience. Like, I know many people, again, people who contributed to this talk, who just quit after the fact. You know, they didn't want to carry on with it because, you know, it's kind of a hard thing to go through. And so after the fact, I would say keep an eye on your team. Make sure they're not working super hard. Like, if you're laying off 20% of the company, you're going to be doing 20% less work, probably 30% less work for the first few months. And something they often don't tell you is that, like, if you lay off 500 people in a mass layoff, you'll probably have 250 people kind of get annoyed and leave in the sort of 6 months after that. And so you're going to have even less, especially if you're not hiring, which is often the case, or you're going to be going through a hiring freeze. So, you know, don't cut 20% of your work, cut 30% of your work, I would say, for the next 6 months at the very least. And of course, help those impacted. Like, even if you know, aren't the one letting them go or whatever, you're not their manager, reach out. Like, you see a lot of these posts on LinkedIn where people are like, oh, you know, there was a layoff and, you know, if you need help. You often don't see the other side of that. And, like, I know many cases where either I've reached out to someone or a friend has reached out to someone, they've put them in contact with other people, and then they've got into, like, really awesome roles, maybe even better roles than they were in before, or they've started their own company or something. But, you know, on the day, that's not going to be something you're thinking about, right? You're going to be depressed that you've kind of lost your job and things like that. And so, you know, just kind of be careful how you deal with it. And I would say that, you know, like a personal story of mine, someone I know was let go. I kind of put him in touch with some of my networks. He'd been looking to move anyway. And so I kind of put him in touch with someone in Europe, and 3 months later he was, you know, out in the UK working a new job out there at some sort of like cool security startup. And so, you know, it can lead to good things, but, you know, don't expect that. And almost certainly the layoffs are going to be in the news. And this is a great example, I think, where you probably can't win. Like, no matter what you do, the news is going to be like ripping into the things you did. There's going to be posts on Blind and Twitter and stuff about it. I would kind of ignore it or learn from it, but also be wary that, you know, they're just looking for clicks at the end of the day, right? So you got to take it with a grain of salt. My final advice is just, you know, everyone deals with this stuff in their own way. but maybe just don't be this guy who ended up posting it on LinkedIn. So, try and avoid that. And that's pretty much me done. So I did want to say, why did I do this talk? I kind of wanted to do this as a bit of a brain dump for those who have to go through this experience. But you can prepare for a lot of this stuff in advance. I'm not saying you have to prepare for mass layoffs of 10,000 people, but I think it's good to be able to revoke infrastructure access at every level. It's good to be able to remove IAM groups and stuff like that. If you can have good individual processes that you can tie together and scale up, then it's going to make your life a hell of a lot easier if you do have to go through this. And, these mass layoffs are often very customized. It's not going to be the typical Friday 5 p.m. removal. You're going to have to tinker with a few bits. But like I say, you can kind of use the techniques that you have to make this a lot easier for you. And that is pretty much me finished. So thanks for coming to the talk today. I'm super excited to hear about the next talk as well, which kind of, I believe, goes more into if you are a part of a layoff, like how do you build redundancy into your career, right?
Yes, I think it's, so there's a lot of people feeling interesting feelings about that whole talk. I think it is a difficult process on in a number of different ways. The comment I made was, I am one of those people who tries to think that on the whole, all people are trying to be good. And so when you're put in this position, whichever position, it just doesn't end well for everyone. But I think it's an interesting, despite it's a difficult topic, it is an interesting way about, the security people are the people that are involved in those things. We are the people that, it's another mental load that is added to people. You're either the laid off or not, the laying off kind of thing. So I think it was really good to have you to go through that, because we like difficult topics. And I think that certainly was one that was also fascinating as well.
Yeah, it's something I hope I never have to do again, to be honest. It's one of those things where, you are doing work and then you kind of get brought into this project and you're having to deal with all of that. And, it's a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions, a lot of work that you've got to do. And it can be pretty tough, right? And I think, me and the people who kind of contributed to this talk, one of them went through 5-6 rounds or something, to the point where there was no company left at the end of it. And I can't imagine how that must be. That's a whole different thing by itself.
Yeah, seeing it sort of destroyed in stages, something that's been built up. Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much for that talk. Fascinating, lots of discussion about it. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll go take a look at the questions. If anyone's got any, happy to answer.
No worries.